Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of React Wednesdays. I'm TJ Van Tol. I work as a developer advocate at Progress. With me is Dan. Dan, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
I'm all right. I'm excited. We got a pretty fun show here today. Actually, I'm going to try to bring up here the website. First of all, if you are new, welcome. This is a show we do actually, we got my countdown a little off. Every Wednesday called React Wednesdays. Basically, we bring in fun, awesome people from the React world and we chat with them about something interesting. So it's telerik.com/React Wednesdays. If you're interested, you can check out some of the shows we have coming up. We've got Charles Pierce to talk about Volta, which is a JavaScript build tool that uses Rust, which should be pretty interesting. We're going to be talking about feature flags with the people at Flagsmith. We have Paige Niedringhouse to talk about working in large, big enterprise React apps, and Tanner Lindsley to talk about React queries. So if you're interested, check out the site, add some of these things to your calendar. It's a pretty fun time.
Looks like a good lineup for sure. There's some great guests, and I'm glad you could pronounce Paige's last name because I would have just sort of linked to look the other way. That's a long name, so.
I do have one name. Speaking of last names, I've mastered one of these last names. So I'm going to welcome on our first guest, Michael Labriola, which I'm now pretty confident I've got because you're a returning champion in this show. We've had you on 3 times.
That's actually that's a hard name.
For me, it is.
Okay, fair enough.
How's it going? You want to introduce yourself for people? You've been on here a few times, but we have some new viewers.
I have. Hey, thanks for having me back. Yeah, so Michael Labriola with Digital Primates. So I'm just a long-term developer and sort of, client guy, right? So I guess that's what I like to say, or at least in a basic way. But honestly, I work on pretty big scale client apps nowadays, mostly in JavaScript, but have been doing it for a very long time. Actually, I don't think I told you this last time, but when I started way back when, like on my original thing in computers was like more AI sort of machine learning stuff, and it wasn't called AI back then, but that's okay. And then I moved into embedded systems, and then I found my way over to the web, and that's where I've been living for the last, we're going to go ahead and round down to say 15 years, but it's like much closer to 20.
So what did you call AI back then?
Well, I mean, it was artificial intelligence, but like machine learning, it meant like nowadays anything that's like vaguely semblance of like machine learning, it gets the AI label. So it's kind of a different thing, but it's all good. Anyway.
Cool stuff. Yeah, and I also want to welcome in our other special guest today, and welcome Tyler McGinnis. How's it going, man?
Hello, it's going. Good to be here. It's been an interesting morning, but we're here. I'm highly caffeinated.
That's
no idea what's going on, but I'm here for it. So
you're highly caffeinated. You're in the right mindset. That's what we're going for here.
Exactly. I'm here. I don't know. Usually I'm like really dense, educational stuff, but I think this is going to be like the opposite. I don't think I'm going to be super valuable today, but hopefully I can be here with some jokes. So
quite possibly the best intro ever.
Yeah. I'm just being realistic, everybody, because usually like if you watch it, it's like I have like a 45-minute video on like some super dense technical topic. This is going to be the exact opposite. I'm here purely for entertainment and fun, and so hopefully it goes well.
Well, for people that don't know anything about you, I'm sure that there are a few people out there. You want to tell them who you are, what you do, all that good stuff?
Yep. I am Tyler. I work at, and I own a company called UI.dev. We do a bunch of stuff primarily around creating courses and content for developers. So we have React courses around React, courses around TypeScript. Work with a few good friends of mine, and that's pretty much it. So a lot of education, a lot of teaching, a lot of writing. A lot of like businessy, marketing-y stuff. I've essentially created like my ideal role. So it's a fun gig. So
yeah, I wanted to give you a shout out too, because actually when I first started, I've got 10, 15 years of web background, but I got involved with React maybe a year and a half ago at this point. Cool. And your courses were actually recommended to me as like a place to start, and they're excellent. So I went through both the React course, the one on React hooks, and I think you have a React TypeScript one now as well, which were all top notch. So
awesome. Thank you so much.
Wanted to give you a shout out for that. And actually, I'm curious. So first of all, I'll say if you're following along with this on chat, I mean, one thing that makes these streams kind of fun, if you have any questions for Tyler, if you have any questions for Michael, feel free to chime them in. This is definitely more of a hangout atmosphere. If you have any questions, feel free to chime in. And but I'll just start, like, I guess, what got you started in this sort of training role? Like, what, because it's, even when you started, it's kind of a crowded space, right? There's a lot of people doing
Yeah,
this
totally.
sort of stuff. So I'm curious what sort of motivated you to get this out there and get started.
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting background. It's always a weird story. So I served a mission for my church for about 2 years, and it's always weird to start there because, like, this obviously isn't a religious podcast, and I don't want to make it one. But in doing that, you're essentially just like teaching people about Jesus for 2 years. So you get really good at teaching, right? And so did that for 2 years, came back, started doing the programming thing, really like that, and then I found that there was this unique position to kind of combine both of those things, developing and also teaching. So I joined a company called Dev Mountain, which was in like the early days of like developer boot camps being a thing. It was the first one in Utah. I was their first full-time hire. That was 2014, I think. Did that for a little bit, and then started doing egghead stuff, and then realized I can kind of do this on my own. And then it kind of snowballed to what it is today, which is like, this is my full-time gig. That I really enjoy. So yeah, it was mostly just like realizing that I really love teaching. I really love seeing like that aha moment with students, and then realizing I could combine that with my passion for like building things and developing things, and also my passion for business into like one whole big mess of just like what is my life today, I guess. So
For those out there that have an interest in creating a course, what advice would you give them? Like, what were the tough lessons that you learned?
yeah, great question. I don't think you should start with, because building it depends. Like when we do a course, it's like a full like 2 to 3 month full-time thing, right? It's a ton of hours, a ton of work. So where I would start is just like writing and creating things, right? Some people will find that they enjoy doing videos better. Some people will find that they like writing better. And when you're first starting out, you're going to kind of be terrible at all of it, and then you'll naturally find what you really enjoy. So that's what I would say is what's nice about the internet is it's permissionless, right? You don't need permission to create content. And so that's why I would start is just whatever medium feels most comfortable to you, to do that, push it out there, get feedback from people, iterate. It's basically just like the generic startup advice, right? Deploy something, push it out, feedback, iterate, repeat that until you're good at it. And then you'll naturally start building an audience. And then once you have an audience, having a course is a lot better. This is like a little bit probably too businessy, but for me, and I get this question a lot. It's not necessarily the course. Like the course needs to be good, but what's more important is the distribution behind it. You can have the best course in the world, but if you don't have distribution and sales, it doesn't matter. So that's why I would start is don't worry about the course, worry about creating an audience of people who enjoy reading your stuff, and then just go from there and you'll naturally kind of find a path. So
Makes sense.
So I've got a random question for you. How did you snag the domain UI.dev?
Yeah, I paid a lot of money for it. Unfortunately, that's the answer. So,
I figured there was two options. Either you paid a lot or you were like waiting the second the domain became available. And like
I should have been. So there's a fun story there. So back then, before UI.dev, it was tylermcginnis.com. And I always knew I'd kind of have to rebrand if I started to like hire people. And so we started kind of like, it was me and one other guy. We started kind of playing around with the idea of rebranding. And it was about the same time that the .dev domains went on sale. But I wasn't really too into the idea. So I was there that day, like looking at React.dev and all of those things. And Google did like the tiered payments. So the first day it was like 10 grand or something. And I was like, I don't want to pay that. That's stupid. Because I wasn't really committed to it. Then naturally, like 6 months later, I was like just browsing for sale domain names. I don't know why I do that, but I do. I saw UI.dev and I was like, oh, that's a good one. And it was $25,000. But I was like, it's not that good. And then like we started getting more serious with the idea of rebranding. And that was really like the only cool domain that was for sale that we liked. And so we bought it for $25,000. And the car that before we went live, I said my car broke down. My car that I was driving before it broke down was like a $4,000 car. So it was like, it's not like I'm just super rich and like was like, oh, 25,000, what the hell? It was more just like it made
I'll
sense.
take two.
Exactly. It made sense where it was like a business decision and I could like justify it. And obviously like it's worked out now. But yeah, definitely that's sadly the answer was I just paid some random person a lot of money to take it.
I'll raise my hand as being a reformed domain name purchaser. I finally let go of stellar purchases like myportablebrain.com, Loan Health USA, Memory Made. These all had really great ideas that I was never going to do anything
Yeah.
about. If you're wondering why GoDaddy's stock price is so high,
yeah, you had good intentions, which is
and I had them on auto renew, which means you don't really have to make the decision today.
exactly.
Well, if anybody else has any questions, because that was kind of interesting, feel free to drop it in chat. But I know, Mike, you were going to do some coding for us. So do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, kind of. So what I think, and we'll talk about it. So, and for everyone in the audience, basically, Tyler and I didn't rehearse any of this or play with it. It really is. We're just going to do it off the cuff. So what I kind of thought is that I've got this app that I did for TJ actually for a DevReach conference. And I've thoroughly broken it on purpose, and probably somewhat on purpose, but that's how we'll see how that goes as we go forward. But pretty much there's just some decisions that have to be made along the way, and we'll put it back together. And my kind of thought is that Tyler can totally criticize everything I do. That'll be cool. And then also, we can kind of talk about why we might do one thing or another. And there's choices all over this. It's not like there's one way to do any of this stuff. So I figure we can kind of talk through some of those things, throw it out there, write some code, and hopefully get something that's sort of back together by the end of it. And that'll work for me.
Let's do it.
Yeah. All right. Let's do it. I like heckling. That's actually my favorite part of the show. It's nice because I started, for some background of the show while he's getting it up, like I started being the one doing a lot of the coding. And then I realized, well, hey, if I can find willing volunteers to go on here so I can just sit back and criticize what they do, why not?
Exactly.
All right, so here's the gist. This was for TJ's DevReach Casino, and so what we were doing is basically making a game of 21 or blackjack, okay? And so we aren't going to worry too much about the rules and stuff like that today, but we were going to adapt it to doing something with React and sort of an interface. So I think the first place we're going to need to do anything, and I've got it stubbed out here, is that we're going to have some state that basically is going to build up the player hand, the dealer hand, and maybe the status of the game. And there's, like I said, about a million ways to do this. But our first decision probably up front is how we're going to manage that state. And so we're going to keep everything today. I don't want to get into like frameworks and things outside of React, but we're going to keep everything today in the sort of React world. But I mean, really that comes across as our first question, is our first direction, which is that we've got the ability to use state. We have the ability to use reducer, and then there's about a million variations from there. So I've got my preference. And Tyler, just because I've read your stuff, I might know yours, but why don't you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, what's funny is I know you're gonna find out very quickly how unopinionated I am with code today, because it's like whatever, I don't care. You're probably gonna assume I like to use reducer, which is a safe assumption. So we can go with that. So give me a quick update on the. I've actually, I don't think I've ever played blackjack.
All good.
Being a nice Southern Utah boy, we're not into that. But,
no.
So basically, give me the rundown. I obviously like a generic idea.
There's going to be some specific rules, but the general gist is the dealer or somebody keeps pushing back cards. We each get one at a time, or you get two to start with, and then the idea is to get as close to 21 as possible without going over. And if somebody goes over, they lose. And so there's a couple more rules than that, but that's the gist.
Cool.
Yeah, you see the two buttons there, hit and stand. The idea is, like, let's say you have 13. If you take another card, if you take a hit, it's a little bit of a gamble because you could get like an 8, which would give you 21, which is the ideal. But you could get something worth 10 that would make you bust and lose. So
got it. Okay, so we need some state representing the player's hands. We kind of already have that in pseudocode there. What do we have status representing?
So eventually we're probably going to want to, especially if we're going to keep going through multiple iterations of it, we'll want to say that somebody won is, maybe in the state where they have to restart where they won. It's probably, we'll call it a poor man's state machine. How's that sound?
That's fair with me. You said state machine. What's the, I'm forgetting his name now, but he's probably going to jump into the chat. David. That's his
David.
Name.
Yeah, we're nowhere near that level of a state machine.
don't say it 2 more times or he'll appear.
He'll appear.
Yeah,
he was actually on a couple of weeks ago, so he might be tuned in right now, waiting to pounce.
Yeah, previous guest of React Wednesdays. So
okay, so we have our player hands, we have the dealer hands. We're probably gonna need some state representing. I assume representing like the deck.
Yeah.
I don't know how. Do we have any like utils that represent like a deck, or do we just gonna?
Oh yeah, we've got some stuff that we're going to work with in the background. And
Oh,
we'll jump on it.
nice.
So we've got some code already set up to be able to do some of that. So actually, that's a great
Perfect.
question. Let's talk about that for just a second. So basically, just so we have a visual representation, we have the ability to represent a card. And then our deck is basically a bunch of the numeric or what we call pit cards. And then we got our court cards, Jack, Queen, King, and then our suits. And then we're basically just building up a deck of those suits and those pip cards and things brought together. So that's one of our decks. And we can shuffle it. We can do a couple different things with it. So we've got some utilities that we'll work with to build out that part of it
Cool.
as we go along. So real quick on this note, obviously use reducer, I'm a fan too, and there's some good things here. I'm kind of a functional guy, so I tended to fall towards this, but there's two variations there, right? Like use state obviously works, and then there's also the use state where you can actually use a function. You want to talk about either of those while I just kind of throw a couple things in here?
Yeah, I can talk about both of them. So use state basically allows you, the sales pitches essentially allows you to add state to your functional components. If you have a like a heavy calculation for your initial state. So for example, if we had some sort of like heavy memoization or like heavy thing we wanted to cache or some heavy calculation, what happens if we just use normal state passing in, say, like an object or some value for that initial state, the next time the function runs, because again, this is all JavaScript, the next time the function runs, React is going to recalculate that thing. So if we had like a function invocation as our initial state, React is going to reinvoke that function every time. But if we pass it a function, then we're basically telling React, hey, instead of running this every time this component re-renders, just run it on the initial one, get the initial value. And then once you have that, never reinvoke this function. So that's the idea there. So
cool. So next thing for you while we're at it, so there's two pieces actually. Obviously, the use state is one way, the reducer is the other, and then there's these two reducer signatures, right? And so I have my own preference here, but when we use reducer, we have the ability to either pass in a reducer function and some initial value, or we can actually pass in a function which is a little more kind of on the Reduxy model. You want to talk about that for just a minute? And while you do, I'm just going to point out to everybody else, all of this is a really simple function right now that starts with a state and is going to take a function application. We'll get into that in a minute. I just want to get the basics set up.
Got it. I actually don't know if I've ever used, or it's been a minute since I've used reducer. I don't think I've ever used the third argument. I've always just used the reducer and then initial state. Is it the same idea?
Yeah, it's the same idea that basically it gets invoked. It's an invocation that allows you to define the initial state.
Without, if it's like a heavy calculation kind of thing?
Yeah, either a calculation or, to be honest, a lot of people use it where it's a little bit like Redux, where all the reducers are initially invoked with an undefined, so you can define your state over in the reducer as opposed to defining it in the view. So, okay, so cool. So basically what I'm going to do here, and depending on how we go about it, we'll do a couple different things. But our use reducer, we're usually going to get a state, and we're going to get a dispatch back that we'll end up doing some stuff with in a moment. But we're going to get that set up so that we can actually have this sort of game reducer. Now, over in this reducer, and to be honest, this is part of the ones that I hope that you'll get a chance to criticize in a little bit. I'm going to take some shortcuts, and then we'll decide if those are good or bad later, if that's okay with you.
Perfect.
But instead of this being an empty object here, I'm going to actually make this a function invocation for now. And it's just going to be my to initial state. And we'll just go look at that for a minute. My to initial state basically just sets up a deck. But because in blackjack, sometimes you don't play with one, it actually takes the number of decks that you might want to use and mix together to start with. So I'm just going to say for right now that we'll start with, let's say, 4 decks that we're going to start with, and that'll be our initial reducer function. All right. So this gets us started, and that'll be great. And it looks just like this over on the left, but it's pretty boring because without dealing the cards and doing something, not a whole lot more to do. And so that gets us to the idea of what we're going to do and how we're going to cause actions. So why don't we talk a little bit about how we're going to update that state?
Yeah, so usually whenever I'm using something like use reducer or Redux, they go hand in hand. One of the first things, if not the first thing I do, is set up all the different actions that can occur that can affect the state that we're dealing with. So for our case, I assume we're going to have, I assume all those buttons are going to trigger some sort of action that'll change the state. So we have a deal action, which I assume will take 2 cards or maybe 1 card, depending on how it works, off the top of the deck and give those probably in the player's hands. And then the dealer's hands too. So is this we have a dealer and we have a player, and they're essentially, is that how it works? We don't have more than one player?
Yeah, you totally got it right.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, deal will basically take something off the top of the deck and then put one in the player's hand and one in the dealer hand, assuming unless we like want to separate those to be two deal actions, but I don't know how that works. Stand will essentially
Basically
like maybe
means that
change turns.
Yeah,
or,
basically
like,
means the player's done and it's going to let the dealer go to see if
Okay.
they can beat the player.
Got it. So if the player stands, then the dealer can go. It's so funny. I'm so naive when it comes to blackjack, which is just like a generic.
No, it's all good. I mean, basically, the player's going to get some cards. They're going to keep going until they think they've done their best by playing the odds to get close to 21, and then they're basically going to challenge the dealer to beat them or not.
Okay.
Yeah, and stand will basically be a trigger for us to say, basically, we end the game at this point. So we have to play out what the dealer does and then the scoring and all of that.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
right,
And
so-
then
Well, go ahead,
yeah,
sorry.
so you're good. Nope, you're good. Go.
I was going to say, so the dispatch is kind of interesting, right? Because, and why I mentioned a little bit of a shortcut here is we can talk about it, but dispatch is the type of thing that gets used in a lot of different ways. And so like kind of the reduxy thing as you're mentioning is that a lot of people will pass in, you know, something that has a type value concept into the dispatch, but really we can pass a lot of different things into here. What's your thoughts on that? How do you normally use dispatch? Do you usually use a type value pattern? What do you use?
Yeah, again, I don't really have like a huge preference. What I like about dispatch is, again, like the decoupling from the updating state with the dispatch itself. Like that's I think the primary thing, especially when you start to use like use effect and you're able to get that separation for like the dependency array. But in our case, I usually kind of just use strings, but if I need a value, we can do the value too either way. I think most people are familiar with the pattern you just did because they're coming from Redux. So we can do that. But yeah, either way, no preference.
Cool. So what if we do something completely different for today, just for fun?
I'm totally down with it. Yeah.
All right. So in this case, I'm actually going to dispatch a function,
Okay.
which is my reducer function. And
Okay.
so what I'm going to do over here, and by the way, I'm not saying that everybody should go do this. I think it's kind of a fun way, especially if you're trying to get things up and running quickly, and sometimes it's got good value. But I'm dispatching that deal reduce function. And so in my reducer over here, what I'm actually going to do is that I'm going to take my state and my reducer function, and I'm going to apply the function I just provided to the state. So what it basically means is that the state's going to start with whatever, and the next state is going to be applying this function to the state. So it's kind of a reducer in a way. Go ahead and criticize the hell out of that because there's a fair number of reasons to.
So to me, like at least my initial reaction is that this overcomplicates what could be kind of simple, because I'm sort of the same way. I would think to pass this like a string to handle, because then my brain could somewhat logically follow the flow.
Yeah, I think
at least it would be my instinct, because if I came in here blind, it's like, okay, to actually follow the flow of the logic, I'm doing a little bit of this, right? Because I'm like, okay, well, what is this reducer function? What is it doing? Like it's like some indirection kind of to understand it, at least in my brain.
Yeah, my brain is still trying to figure out what the heck's going on before I can criticize it.
All right. Well, so think about it this way, right? Is that if we have, normally when we have an accumulator, we accumulate over an array and we produce a new value. So this would be kind of like the idea of accumulating over an array of functions, each one of those being applied to the accumulator until we get a final value.
When you said you're a functional guy, you meant you're a functional guy.
He's drank the Kool-Aid.
That's one of the reasons why. Like, I'm not actually saying that you should always do it this way.
Usually
but
people are like, "Oh, I like functional programming." They're like using map and like, Redo. And he's like, he's like applying, all these.
Yeah, well, I mean, I had you on the call today. Like, why not take this into a kind of a crazy realm and have a little fun with it?
I'm with it. Yeah.
All right, well, let's just throw it out there. So just to clarify how it's walking through, we dispatch this and we now have a function, right? Which means our reducer is the type of thing that takes the current state and it takes some something. And normally, like it said in Reduxy sort of land, this would have been something that has the shape of type and maybe a value, right? That we do something with. Yeah. Here, we just happen to be taking something which is a function, and then we're going to yield the next state by applying that function. So for fun, let's just go through and see what it would take to write that out, just so we can at least get like kind of the deal going. And this will start clarifying kind of the rules, I think, a little bit. So we're going to have our deck out there, and when we want to make our new thing for the player, what we need to do is we need to draw some cards off that deck. Now, this is just an implementation detail of the game, but what happens is that there's 4 cards drawn up front. And the reason I'm actually kind of referencing them directly at the starting point is that the first card goes to the player, the second card goes to the dealer. So we need to mix and match a little bit here, okay?
Yeah.
So what we could do though is a starting point is like our player hand could be, okay, we're kind of card 1 and card 3, and our dealer hand is card 2 and card 4. But we also need to kind of do one more step here, which is that we need to get the rest of our deck once that's done.
Just got to take those cards away from the deck. Yeah, okay.
And that's our new deck, all right? So if we did that as a starting point and rebuilt it, then when we deal, we should get 2 cards allocated to the player, 2 cards to the dealer, and then the deck is whatever is left. That make sense?
Yeah, I'm gonna remember this example because I think this is one of the best explanations of why like destructuring and the rest parameter makes sense. Because before I knew how those worked, like that logic was so much harder to write because you'd have to get into the like array,
like slicing.
In the JavaScript, the array slice method has like the worst signature ever. I have to Google it to remember how it works every time.
And then you're like, wait, is it splice or is it slice?
Yeah, I still look that up.
Yeah, and then what's the index? So yeah, this is like super clean. That's all I wanted to say.
The other thing too to me is it explains the shape, and that's gonna just like this destructuring does, right? It's like it explains to me that like there's an object and it has a shape, and what part of that shape is it has a deck, and that thing's an array. So like even though we're not in something like TypeScript right here, you can get a pretty good sense of what that S0 parameter looks like, or at least the important parts from the destructuring. So I see it as both functional or like helpful, but I don't want to overload functional here, but also as a scripture of what you're actually providing to this function. And the same thing here. Like, oh, okay, well, what am I getting? Well, there's card 1, 2. It sort of explains the shape of what that thing looks like. Anyway, just a bonus. I see it as a form of documentation too.
Yeah, I like that.
All right, cool. So that's cool, and that makes that button work. And so we have a deal now, although we're kind of bored again in terms of what we need to do. So we need to hit. So I'm going to keep with my crazy version of what I've been doing here, which is I've got things for hit and stand. Okay, so I'm just going to wire those up real quick, and we'll say that in the case of hit, we'll dispatch our hit, and in the case of stand, we're going to dispatch our stand function.
Okay, this is starting to make a little more sense to me because I see you're taking a function and you're passing in the sort of appropriate version. So it's almost like, as opposed to a string deal and a string hit, it's almost just like a function named deal that does it, sort of thing.
Yeah. Think about it another way, and there are great times to use this, and we can get into that at some point, but like when you pass a string, you're effectively mapping that string to something, right? And whether you're doing it through a switch statement, an if statement, a map, a lookup, in one way or another, you're eventually taking that string and you're mapping it back to something. And I will 100% admit that it is easier, especially when you're debugging and things, to see a string move across and know what it's mapping to. And it gives you a layer of indirection where you can maybe do other things. But at the end of the day, why I called this a shortcut for right now is, instead of mapping a string and a value to a function where I really wanted to pass the value and the string in anyway, I'm just shortcutting it and saying just send along the function.
So your argument is actually there may be less indirection.
Yeah, I actually think there is, right?
Interesting. Yeah, interesting.
I mean, it's also more directly coupling these two things, which means that you can't intercept it, you can't do other things, but I actually think it's more linear.
It's good too, because Christian just asked, I just caught this, the pros and cons of different approaches to what to use as a dispatch action, and we kind of
Christian and I don't agree on these things at all. And he's got very good, well-rationed reasons why, but that's never stopped me. So, all right, cool. So, all right, now we've got these hit buttons and these standards are doing something, although my functions don't do them yet. So, but the cool thing now about this is that we're pretty much just implementing what it means to do each of these things. So like, what did it mean to deal? It meant to draw some cards off of the deck, and man, we have a deck. So what does it mean to hit? Well, it's kind of the same thing, right? What do we need to do? Well, the player hand is going to change. The deck is going to change. And although I don't know that I would do this the same way, and we can talk about how I might do this differently later, the status could change, because basically if I go too far over, I might just lose. We might not have to play out the rest of it. If I go over 21, my game is over. So this could mean any number of things for the user. or the player. So in this case, I'm going to draw another card off the deck, and then we'll still have our remainder. So that should look just like it did before, right? Where we go off and we say we got our deck and we got a remainder, and I can't type today, and that's cool. So what does it mean to get a player hand? Well, the player hand would basically be, well, whatever the player's hand was, and they're going to get a new card. And the dealer's hand is going to be unchanged. Okay, that wouldn't really actually change at all in this particular case. So in a minute, we'll probably just get rid of that. We don't need to update that one for right now. But what's the deck going to do? Well, just like above, the deck's going to be a remainder. And then we don't have to mess with this right now, but if we wanted to, and again, I probably, if I were doing this differently, I might do this in 2 passes, but there's a couple different reasons. We might need to figure out what the new total is going to be for the player. So I'm going to promote this for just a second, and I'm going to say that this is going to be called news player hand. So we'll just do new player hand, and that'll be equal to that little construct there. And the reason I'm doing that is because we're going to need to do a little bit of math on that thing. So as we were kind of indicating before, and I made a function that'll do this for us, but all we're going to do here is we're going to say something like that we have a total, right? So we'll say player total. Wow, let's try again. I'm going to blame my keyboard. It's my keyboard's fault. And I'm just going to say there's a total of new player hand. All right. And so this is going to give us a value. Now, again, in a more perfect world, I might actually kind of wrap this in a little bit higher order way so that this stuff wasn't done in the same place as the hit. But let's stick with it for a minute. So all I was going to do here is say, well, tell you what, if the player's total is now greater than, and I'm a constant guy sometimes, so I'm going to say the maximum sum. Then what I want to do is I'm going to call this function called toFinalStatus for now, and I'm just going to pass in the player total, and we'll look at what that does. Some of this has to be done through the magic of television for our time. Otherwise, we'll just do the existing status. Okay, so our hit function basically going to draw a card, throw it on the player's hand, and then we're going to see what the new total is. And as long as the total is less than the max sum, we don't change states. But if we do actually see a new value, or if it's over, we change it. So what would you do differently about that, Tyler? What would you look at differently?
I actually, I don't know if this is a gotcha, but I actually think this, it shows the value of like a good abstraction, right? Because there's actually kind of a lot of complexity going on here, but it doesn't really feel too complicated, right? Especially because like we're able to break out the reducer, so like handle their own complexity. And then in here, we have these utils that are also managing like the mathy complexity of things. So this to me feels fairly easy to follow, just because I feel like we've done a pretty decent job of drawing the lines of where those abstractions go. So I'm all for it.
And TJ, how do you feel about it? Since you were kind of saying before, a little bit of what I do is a little hard to follow.
I like this too. You did mention that normally you would do this as 2 passes, which sort of messed with my brain a little bit, because I would definitely do it how you did it here, because I kind of like seeing it all here, because it's,
I agree.
You take a hit. I sort of want to know right now what's the status of the game, because this is where I would go to look for that sort of stuff in the code.
Yeah, I guess, and I think I'm about 2 minds about this, right? So obviously I did it this way, so I don't totally hate it. But there is something to be said for the idea that hit did the work of doing the hit, but then the calculating whether you won or lost sort of thing is maybe a different sort of thing. So maybe after the hit is done, then we calculate it as opposed to wrapping it all. Because if you think about it, if I were to actually rename this thing, it would be sort of the hit and then recalculate the status reducer.
Yeah. Right, it's got some hidden value in there.
Yeah, I try to, when I work with a lot of our junior devs, I try to ask them to write functions that don't have to use the word and when they explain what it does to me. And this one has to use the word and.
Yeah.
At the same time, though, like, because then what would you use to trigger that pass, though? Like with the status, you have to set like a special status, like need to figure out if you won or not sort of thing. Like,
no, we could do something like, as an example, we could say with new status. And then we would have the ability to potentially apply that status to the result of each one of those. So that's how I would do it, maybe as an alternative, is that it would be a scenario where this returned a value, which then this computed the final new status on. It's an alternative look at it. I don't know that you need to do it that way, just saying that's another way we could approach it.
Interesting. I think I tend to favor code that's more direct, and I would take the function with the and in it over the indirection of another layer of functions. But
well, you're in luck because we're going to.
yeah.
Yeah, I think this is, especially for if there's any like more beginners watching, this is a really interesting conversation because both sides have a pretty strong argument.
Yeah.
Neither of them feel like more correct, depending on like who you talk to. Like I'm with TJ, where it's like it just seemed like my brain has an easier time solving the former one, but also to Michael's point, that doesn't necessarily mean it's better, right?
I could also see too, like this, like blackjack, there's a final state of blackjack. Like once you finish blackjack, it's done, sort of thing. But in like a real world scenario where this is your real app, there could be more statuses and more logic that creep into this over time, because you get requirements for a new feature of this. So having your functions more separated, you could argue, is better in like a constantly evolving sort of app scenario. Whereas in this case, it's like blackjack. The rules of blackjack, there's an end to your implementation essentially. So the complexity here, even though this function might do 2 or 3 things, it's still like a 12-line function. So it's not horrible.
It's not going to bloat too bad over the next 2 years.
Yeah.
To look at this, just so you see it, this is just really simple. For right now, I kept this one dead simple. Basically, if the dealer totals over the max, the dealer bus. If the player's over it, the player bus. If they're the same, it's what's called a push or a draw. And other than that, we find out if the player is better than the dealer. So that's what our 2 final status does, just to jump into it, okay?
Yeah.
What's funny too is like after we did talk to David, I start to see state machines everywhere. Like before
it's a trap, man. It's a trap.
Before I would have never thought that way, but now I'm like, well, crap. Like, because you might, I don't know where the logic is. You might already have it in there, but things like when do you disable the deal button? When do you disable those other buttons? It's like, I wouldn't have before thought in the sense of state machines. I would have thought of, well, I'm going to need a lot of if checks, but
which is like an ad hoc state machine, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I've never driven through a traffic light without thinking of David K. Piano. for the last 18 months, it's terrible. It's
fantastic.
I don't recommend it.
I think he'll be pleased to hear that, though. We'll make sure that the word gets his way.
Make that a clip.
Christian and I one time had a discussion over our Keurig coffee maker because it had a big problem where if you went slightly out of order on the buttons, it couldn't work anymore. Like, this is such a solvable problem. So there you go. It extends everywhere. All right. Well, so we now have the capability that we can say, great, we're at 20 already. So for whatever terrible reason, we decide to get another card and we are losing. So we have the ability to lose, but we don't have the ability to like let the dealer try and win. So that's what our stand function is going to do. Okay. So in our stand function, again, we're just kind of narrating now, which is what I do like about some of this code, is that we're sort of narrating the rules of what it means to stand. So in this case, we're going to be, and I warn you up front, a little bit fast and loose with the code here, but that's okay. So we're going to say that we're going to do a total of the dealer hand to start with. And that's because of the fact that in general, like there's got to be some rules. And so, because I was going to be very thorough about this, I decided to look up what the general advice in Las Vegas was. And the general advice is that if the dealer total was less than something we call the stand threshold, and in this case, that stand threshold was 17, that they usually don't continue because the odds just aren't in their favor of winning. So if it's less than the threshold, then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and say, great. If it's less, then I want a new card. And so I've got my remainder again, and I've got my deck, which is all cool. And then that's going to let me make a new dealer hand after I draw that off. And
are you going to bust out some recursion here? Because like,
I am, man. That's where this is going.
We need a bingo card for this because you're hitting on all the good you're saying.
All right, so that all seems legit, right? So we get a new dealer hand, and what does that mean? Well, that's pretty cool. We have our new hand, and now we, may be okay. But what do we need to do? Well, like you said, somebody clicking the end button there, stand, basically means the dealer should go until we're all done. So how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to go ahead and do a little recursion. And we'll just say that what are we going to do? Well, we'll go ahead and pass in what our state was, but then we're going to update our dealer hand being our new dealer hand and we'll update our deck being our remainder, and we'll keep going, right? We probably shouldn't write recursion without figuring out our base case, so that'll be kind of cool. So what we're going to do here actually ends up being really simple, right? Is that we don't have to figure out any of this junk. All we need to do is figure out once this is done, in other words, once this is over, what our final status is. So we'll just say to final status, and we're going to pass in the total of the player's hand, and then we'll pass in the dealer total, and we're done. So if we do that, and if I wrote most of that right, we should be able to say stand and then let the dealer either try to bust or win. And it'll keep going and keep going sort of recursively to figure it out. So to be clear, all we really did here, since that was a function anyway, is that we just basically said, well, go ahead and update the dealer hand, the deck, and keep going until we get to the point where the dealer is not willing to do any more hitting, and then recurse our way back up until we have the final status and kick ourselves out. So that is one other little piece here, which again, it's not that you'd have to do it this way, but there is something I think a little bit nice about having that, the fact that we're dispatching the stand reducer with the state, and now we got something that's just sort of self-similar here. So how does that strike you?
Yeah, I'm just glad finally my all my work figuring out how to calculate Fibonacci sequence paid off.
Yeah.
It took 7 years, but now is the moment where it paid off in the wild. No, I mean, to me that seems reasonable.
Yeah, I wonder, like, I can think of, and I've been developing software professionally for, I don't know, like 13, 14 years at this point. I think there's been like 3 times maybe I've used recursion. But every time I have, it's been like a eureka moment of like, oh, wait a minute, like
This is it. Yeah.
It's like we with the Fibonacci sequence. Like, I can't believe it, but the moment is now.
Exactly. And what I love about it too, if there's anyone out there like struggling with recursion, is there's really, again, it's always so clear. Like if it's one of those things where it's like, maybe I'll use recursion, like don't use recursion. But if it's one of those things where it's like, oh, clearly, like we need to do this until we get like a base value, like, or like clearly this is the moment to do it. So I don't know. I remember back in the day, like I think I was always so confused with recursion. Because I don't have a traditional CS background. And I think one like Saturday, I found a bunch of like Java recursion problems, and I just like converted them all to JavaScript. And essentially like brute force my brain into understanding it. Because there's really only like a few very clear examples of when to use it. And all of those are very obvious. So if you're in that position in your career where you're like, recursion is still a little bit confusing, just find all the recursion problems you can find, and eventually you like your brain like pattern matches it for this moment right here, because it's like, oh, this is very, very obvious. So
also the other way I think about it too is that I tend to use things like reducers and such when possible, and reducers work really well if you have a relatively fixed set of things, meaning we don't know how many times we were going to do this. When we started diving down, you can basically think of recursion is really great when you have to keep going until you're done, whatever that means.
Exactly.
And other techniques tend to be better if you have to do something complex, but you have a fixed number of times you know you're going to do it. And there's all kinds of fuzziness on there because there's relationship between them. But yeah, I agree with you. Like if you find a handful of examples where it's recursion, and you don't have to try to get it in somewhere, but at some point in time where you're like, well, what I want to do is this again, that's probably a good indicator that you're starting to get to a recursive problem. Is that what I want to do is
parsing a tree structure? That's definitely recursion.
Yeah, well, I mean, but again, even if you take it out of that specific example, why is it recursion? Because, well, what it's like to take apart any given tree is kind of like what it's take apart a given node, so on and so forth. It's just that there's this kind of fractal thing, right? It's self-similar. Here, what do I want to do? I want to do the same thing again. And what do I want to do it on? I want to still do it on a deck, and I still want to do it on a hand. And then what do I want to do again? I want to do something on a deck and a hand, and all the way until it stops being beneficial to me. And if I get that wrong, that's where recursion really goes wrong.
Yeah.
Nothing goes on forever. It just goes on until you Stack Overflow.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you show the code you have to determine whether those buttons are enabled or disabled? Maybe we can.
It's totally terrible. We can look at that.
Yeah, we can judge that for sure.
Yeah, definitely judge that, because basically what you'll see here in terms of this is that some of these things that I just structured out of state, so the player's hand, the dealer hand, these two are just projections, right? So that's going to project out the cards. So if we go look at that for just a second, and you can see it's more than once here, but if you look at the hand, it's basically just saying, okay, take the cards I was given, map them out for each one of them, grab the path, and it basically, this is a little bit hacky, and that's fine. But if we're playing, and by the way, you happen to be the dealer, then we're supposed to hide the top card, right? So that's what that's doing. Other than that, it's always showing the image. But then what you asked about specifically was this. And it's not that it's awful, but it's certainly something that you could see being a little better. And this is where, again, it's a little weird in terms of sort of string matchiness, even though they're constants. But what are we really saying? Well, if the deal button is disabled while we're playing, the hit button is disabled if we're not playing. And that's really all that ends up being here. So it's pretty simple, but it wouldn't be this simple if we started implementing to other points, TJ, your point on complexity. There actually are more rules in terms of blackjack. You can do more things. This is a really simple implementation. And if we started getting into more of these, this would get messier and messier and messier because your states would get different. So this is only benefiting because of the fact that we have a really simple implementation.
Yeah, you could splitting and betting. I could totally see this.
Yeah, blow up.
You're right. This actually is way cleaner than I was expecting it to be, because I didn't think about it. But really, in this state of the game, you can derive everything based off one sort of state. Yeah. But you're right. Real world, this is the sort of thing that could definitely get out of hand.
Excellent demoware.
Yeah.
But I also think too, there's value in making it like not trying to solve your future problems initially.
Sure.
Right? Like solve your current problems. Then if you have future problems, your brain is to a point where like you understand the current problems, and then you can kind of abstract from there. So I think both of those are totally valid.
Yeah, for me, like I almost never start with use reducer. I start with just use state until I realize, oh, this isn't sufficient, so I need to introduce another layer here.
Well, and to be honest, there's a squishy middle there too. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Tyler.
I was just gonna say, I feel like more junior developers, that's something they try to do, is like they solve a problem and then they start trying to solve problems that they may have, and then problems that those problems may have, and then you just like you never get to the point where you're shipping anything.
All the way down.
Yeah, exactly. So just solve the current problems you have, ship something, and then if future problems arise, go from there. And if not, then you're good, right? So.
Yeah, I think the famous phrase is all problems can be solved with abstraction, except the problem of too much abstraction.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I mean, this ends up being simple right now, but to that point, it would get harder, but that's also reasonable. Here's a good indicator, and I don't know, I find this is a good way for me to know if things are getting too complicated. It's how many things I have to pass in. Like this feels okay, I'm passing in a hand and a status and a dealer. If this started being like 12 things, that would be a pretty good indicator this was getting out of hand. Same thing for the controls. If I was passing in like 15 things, I would start feeling more and more like it was getting out of hand. And that's probably the time when I'd say, hey, maybe time to hit the pause button and figure out how we can handle this a little differently.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good rule of thumb. I agree with that.
Well, I was saying about the squishy middle.
Cool, guys, we're coming up. We got a handful of minutes. Sorry, Mike's internet. He warned us that the
audio,
is capable of taking out his internet.
Welcome to latency.
So
Mike wants to talk about the squishy middle.
Yeah, I want to hear about the squishy middle now. So go for it.
No, I'm so intrigued by this.
Yeah, that was quite the cliffhanger.
Well, I was doing my best to build suspense. All right. So all I was saying is that use state also has a functional version too. If you guys can hear me on this one.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, cool. So all I was saying on the squishy middle is that like there's also the fact that all these kind of boil down to the same thing if you really go into the React code, but use state also has an ability to like yield state based on a function. And so I was going to say there's a squishy middle between like use state, use reducer, which is kind of like use state with a function. All I was going to say is I tend to start off even myself with saying use state until you know you need something more. And especially if the values are discrete and they're not derived, meaning that my view is just going to know like it's this or this or this or this, then great, use state is cool. what I try to use reducer is as soon as the next state is going to be more derived or is going to have more logic behind it, because then I don't want to couple that stuff in my view. And I also kind of want to not even have to bring it into my view in order to figure out what to do with it. Anyway, that's my rule of thumb.
Yeah, I agree.
So sorry, TJ, you were saying you were trying to close me off and shut me up, and that's probably a good point.
Yeah, this is trying to like, I've got the hook on the stage for you. No, all I was going to say is we have a handful of minutes left. So I wanted to give chat one last sort of opportunity. If you have any questions, Tyler, for Mike, anything else that came in, or if you guys have any questions here before we wrap up, we got a few minutes here. So I guess last call on anything we did today, or really anything at this point.
Yeah, and I think before we close, I wouldn't mind if Tyler gave a brief overview of the types of courses that he has and what's appropriate, because there's so many courses out there and UI dev has a lot. So if you could just kind of walk the group through what's there and who it's for and what some learning paths are for different kind of folks.
Yeah, great question. So we have, starting off, we have advanced JavaScript and modern JavaScript. Modern JavaScript isn't so modern anymore. It was very modern when it was created. So it's like ES6 plus stuff. And then advanced JavaScript goes into the parts of JavaScript you'll probably never use, but that are good to know. We do like prototypal inheritance, composition, all of those kind of advanced JavaScript stuff. From there, we have a React course and then a React hooks course. This year will probably be, we basically try to mirror the docs. So right now the docs are, at least last I looked, were like class-based. That'll probably change this year as they refactor those to be hooks-based. So we'll also do the same with our courses. We have, what else? Our newest courses are, we have a brand new TypeScript course by Alex Anderson, which is great. He did a great job there. And then if you're using TypeScript with React, we also have a course on that. I think we have a few more. We have a Redux course, which goes through like building our own implementation of Redux, which is fun. Probably a few other ones that are escaping my brain right now. But those are the main ones. So if any of those sound good, check it out.
If you imagine there's 3 classes of developers out there, one knows nothing about JavaScript and maybe they come from a different paradigm completely. 2, they know some JavaScript, they've used jQuery, but they checked out a long time ago and now feel left behind and want Tyler to save them. And 3, they use JavaScript every day, but when they go to sleep at night, they fear they're not doing the best and brightest things with it, and they know you have some juice for them too. So how would you recommend your courses for those 3 sets of folks?
First 2, I'd start with advanced JavaScript and modern JavaScript. Those courses assume we don't have any like pure beginner courses, just because there's already so many resources for them. That both of those courses assume you either have a little bit of JavaScript background or you have like Java background or some other like technical background, right? So both of those are like, we're not going to teach you how to like invoke a function, but we will talk about like inheritance versus composition and more advanced topics like that. The third tier, which is basically like you're already familiar with JavaScript and you want to kind of catch up on the newer stuff, I'd recommend either picking like TypeScript or React and going from there, because at that point you probably are dangerous with JavaScript, and those will hopefully make you less dangerous, I guess. So
let me throw one thing out there too, just a side note. I can't recommend Tyler's stuff enough. Just for even at our org at DP where we're training folks, we have a bunch of curriculum we go through, but when we get to React stuff, we have effectively outsourced that to you because you did a fantastic job with it. So I just wanted to point out there, I can't recommend it enough. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much. And this year, it should be a fun year. We haven't really announced it yet. We're going to put a lot of more emphasis on like community building. So right now, if you're taking a course, you're kind of just doing it on your own. We're hoping to make that a little bit more collaborative with other people also taking the course. So a lot of stuff there. We do like events too, which is basically usually weekly. We have someone come in. I think David, we've said his name a lot. I think he's doing one soon if he didn't already do it about state machines. But every week we have someone come in who is not me and not the other Alex who works with us, just about something they're interested in that's cool. So like I think we've had Amelia, who's like brilliant at D3. She's done one. I think Mark Erickson is on the schedule if he hasn't already done one already about Redux. Someone who you guys are having on, Tanner Lindsley's done one on React Query. So that's a cool perk too. So yeah, it should be a fun year for us. We're really excited for what we have coming up. So
you have a lot of great things going on.
Thank you.
Yep, and I'll give my thumbs up for the courses as well. I've went through them, and I just dropped UI.dev into the chat as well. So if you're curious, that's the great play to check them out. Mike, I know we did have, maybe you could give, we had a question in from chat about the implementation and the way you use dispatch again. Maybe you could give like if you still have your screen, like just like a really simple overview of what we did today, and just maybe we could use that to wrap up.
Yeah, we can do that. And also, I'll just say a couple things while we're doing it too. I think it'll be easier. So, all right. So what to keep in mind here is that dispatch doesn't actually, even if you look at what dispatch is not the type of thing that requires you to have a certain shape. It doesn't require or dictate what you're allowed to pass through. So just think of this as a foo. It doesn't matter that it happens to be not an, a object with properties, but it happens to be a function, which is, yeah, you get the point. So, but in this case, all I'm doing is saying dispatch and a function. And so this dispatch is intrinsically wired up to whatever is in use reducer here. So that means that when I call dispatch, this reducer, the one I called game reducer, is going to receive two things always by the definition of being a reducer. It's going to return, you get the current state, so getting rid of the extra junk out of here. So it's going to get the current state, and then it's going to get whatever I dispatched, right? Oh man, I cannot type today. Whatever I dispatch. All right, that's not an interface. It's going to get whatever I dispatched, and then I can do something with it. So all I really did in this case was say, well, whatever I dispatched, if we go back here, well, that happened to be a function instead of another type of object. So if that was a function, then I can apply it to the state. And so since this is going to return something, all really saying is that the state plus the function is that. And in the old version of any sort of scenario that we see in JavaScript, we have the old sum function, which is basically what do we get? We get a value, and what are we going to return? Well, we're going to return, and we'll just actually call this a total for right now. We get a total plus the new value, right, as a sum function. So we're adding 1, 2, 3. So all I'm saying is that what if this instead of 1, 2, 3, what if this was a function that took a value and added 1, right? And maybe this was a function that we could do the same thing, or we could do something different that added 2, that added 3. So now instead of this being a value, it's function. So what's the new total? It is the function of that total. And so all that would happen now is, we would really have to put a starting value in at this point. But let's say it started with 0. First time through it would be 0 plus 1, it would be 1. Next time through it would be 1 plus 2, it would be 3. Next time through it would be 3 plus 3. So this is all I really did, is this piece, which is pretty common in functional stuff. It's just so be it that I happen to do it with React's reducer instead of the reduce function. But at the end of the day, all we're doing is applying a function to the last state to get the next state. It's a question of where and what you see as readable and don't. And I got to tell you, to be honest, to me, that is very much eye of the beholder sort of thing. Some people find functional programming completely impossible to read. Some people like it. That's the difference. For me, it's not bad, but I wouldn't fault anybody for not liking the way I went about doing that.
Good stuff. I think that's a sort of a good note to wrap up on. Last thing we like to do is just drop where can we follow, find people, any last links we want to give. Tyler, what's the best place if people have questions for you? What's the best place to follow you, keep in touch, that sort of thing?
Yep. Twitter is @Tyler McGinnis, and my email is tyler@ui.dev.
Cool. Mike, do you have anything you want to plug? Twitter, anything?
So you can follow Digital Primates on Twitter. You can follow me personally. I'm Labriola, or my last name, Labriola @digitalprimates.net. Feel free to shoot me something if you want to. We'll go from there. Other than that, if we ever get out of COVID land again, maybe I'll see Tyler at a conference and we'll go from there.
Of course. Are all of you in Chicago, or just you, Michael?
So just me usually. At the moment, I'm not even there, but TJ's in Michigan, Dan's in the Carolina, the northern one, and and I'm usually in Chicago.
Cool.
All right.
And Dan, you got plugs you want to drop here?
Yeah, I'll mention our Enterprise React newsletter. Our developer staff submits all the articles, so they're developer approved. We've had stuff by Tyler in there, I'm pretty sure. If not, we will next issue. They drop every 2 weeks. We never spam or sell your email address. So if that's your kind of thing, Google it up and sign.
Yep, and I think I've got every links. So I've been trying to drop every link that people have been giving in the chat. I'll just wrap up by saying thanks to everybody for joining. We do this every Wednesday, sort of same time slot. So if you've enjoyed this at all, like I said, we've got some cool guests coming up. It's a great place to just hang out with people in the React world. You can sort of skim, find topics you're interested in. Come hang out. So thanks again, Tyler. Thanks, Mike. This is a lot of fun. I had fun at least.
I had
Of
fun
course,
too.
yeah, that's a blast.
Thanks, Tyler. Cheers.
All right.
Bye, Dan.
See
Bye,
you, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.